Equity is a pun in economics, but here we mean income inequality. It is often said that the rich is getting richer and the poor is getting poorer. Now, pause for a moment and explain how that is actually a myth, or in what circumstances it would be a myth. So take your time and write your answer before you proceed. Economic systems are defined by two determining factors, that of ownership and distribution, which give us two main systems. So when we talk about ownership, that would be the public property or private property. And when we talk about distribution, that would be either state allocation or market allocation. You can also think about many mixes in between the two. So you can think of these two as kind of extremes. And most countries, most economies are a mix of these two. But by understanding these two, then you can understand the mixes also. All right. So there are certain names for market economy. These are synonymous. And there are certain other names for socialism. These are also synonymous. When we say centralized or public, these terms refer to government. All right, so these are synonymous. Whenever you see public or centralized, especially in macroeconomics, it means governmental. When you look at the quota system, it basically means a fixed share. One thing I wanna say here is that I would avoid the word capitalism and also communism. Both of these terms are loaded. All right, they're kind of taboo, and we don't want to get caught up with connotations. All right, so this is a fallacy. Watch out, guys. It's a fallacy to use loaded labeling instead of an argument. To label something as communism or capitalism, either way, and then conclude that this is bad or wrong. Just by our labeling, it doesn't prove something. We have to actually offer an argument instead of a loaded term. So let's avoid loaded terms and keep things neutral and instead offer evidence and data. This is a super important slide. I want to show you how to think and argue professionally. We looked at two systems of free market economy and socialism. We want to see what their own proponents say in support of their claims, regardless of whether it's true or not, right? So we talked about ownership. If it's private property, there are a couple of considerations in favor of it, right? Such as efficiency and liberty. The opposite of that is public property, and again, we have a couple of considerations in favor of it, right? So avoiding abuse and having a social cohesion. So that's a question of property. In terms of allocation, there is market allocation, for which it's argued that it gives us cooperation and no waste. And the alternative to that is state allocation, and the arguments for that is we have greater equality and more social well-being. All right, so look, notice that all of these are desirable things. We like them. All of these are valuable. So what we want to do is we want to kind of bundle them together so that we have a more coherent frame of thinking. Let's go back to the French Revolution. Do you remember the three mottos of the French Revolution? Right. So one of them was liberté. So we have that element here. Another one was fraternité, right? So we have that also here. And another one was égalité, okay? So we can kind of use that as a way of bringing things together. And as an economist, there is one major value that every economist should have and is very sensitive about, and that is efficiency, all right? So we have these things here. Now, if you look at fraternity, fraternity overlaps with efficiency and also with equality. All right. So what we can do is that we can merge equality and fraternity into equity. All right. So we can have three main values that all of them are very noble. All of them are noble objectives. We would like to achieve all of them as much as possible. But let's remind ourselves we live in an imperfect world. So we cannot have everything. There's no utopia. We must prioritize, and there's going to be some compromise. We cannot achieve all of these values and objectives to the highest extent possible. So we have to be realistic. We have to look at our objectives. First of all, we have to prioritize, and second of all, we have to be practical. To what extent can we practically achieve each of these objectives, and which one of them could have the greatest problems at the expense of other objectives? A very major concern today is all the inequality that we see. And a more technical term for it is equity. If you find equity too vague, you can think of inequality. They're similar in our context. The argument behind the concern for inequality is that we have enough to sustain everyone, but what if? An economic pie is an expression for economic well-being, total consumption, wealth, real GDP. And the solution here is through redistribution by taxation. That is called the Robin Hood effect. If you know the myth, that's exactly what Robin Hood used to do, steal from the rich to help the poor. The problem is that sometimes the ideal myth doesn't translate into reality so ideally. What a mess. And that is done by the welfare state, which is a form of government with two essential features. It assumes the responsibility for everyone's well-being, and it claims the right to override their freedom. There are three different levels of equity. The strongest form is equal access for everyone. Oh, isn't she cute? Or the second level is let's have a minimum social insurance, social security, or at least no inequality due to factors beyond one's control, that everyone must have the chance to progress. So pause here, record the slide number, and summarize this slide in one sentence in your own words. Equality or equity is a very valuable goal. It's a noble ideal, but it has major practical problems. When it comes to implementation, it has many complications which end up defeating its purpose. Let's look at some of these limitations. It's very subjective. There's a lot of controversy around it, and we end up spending a lot of resources in the form of political debate and legislation just to agree on what fairness means to begin with. And we can't agree. It's really a can of worms. When you have a large tax money concentrated in one place in the hands of the government, it attracts everyone's attention to appeal to the politicians and get a bigger piece of it. Remember, self-interest is at the core of human behavior for both politicians and all of those involved in the process. The project has very noble intentions, but it's easily hijacked by those who have high stakes, those with connections, those whose voices are heard more. Even among the poor, it is the ones who are relatively well off who end up getting these benefits. It doesn't really solve the problem of poverty, nor even inequality. And that's what the studies show. There has rarely been any government welfare program which made a significant effect on its objectives. This is not a coincidence. It's the law of unintended consequences. Besides, much of the wealth is wasted in the process due to all the steps and lags involved. The very nature of government is coercive, and the government's source of revenue is taxation, which is also coercive. Liberty is a high cost to pay as a society, and especially the poor, who lose their autonomy and dignity through these provisions. Welfare programs often limit the opportunities available to the poor and thus create generational poverty, which is a real problem. Remember, there is no free lunch. When someone says equality is important, you must ask at what expense. And when someone says all the inequality is bad, you must ask, what's your alternative? And that alternative better be something feasible, not a mere ideal. Pause and take notes. Sometimes poverty becomes a trap, also called the welfare trap or unemployment trap. That's when the recipients don't have the incentive to earn income. It's a very rational behavior given how the system is set up. There's a trade-off between welfare benefits and work incentives. Welfare support sharply reduces economic gains of being employed. It could even lower one's net income, including the benefits, because people will no longer be qualified for those benefits. And people respond to incentives. That's what we're creating, a society of dependence, a society where people's concern is not to empower themselves to prosper at work and be more competitive, but how to qualify for quote-unquote free benefits at the expense of the rest of the society. And we proudly call this socialism, with a lot of praise and glory. And remember, welfare benefits are generated by taxing the employers, but guess what? When the employers are taxed, they pass it on to their workers. So it is the working class who is taxed in order to fund the unemployed. And in the process, it adds to the costs of employers, reducing their ability and willingness to hire. So those on welfare are receiving these generous benefits, and they don't see any good prospects for employment. So they rationally choose to not exert as much effort voluntarily. This is distortion of incentives. Oh no, what have you done? Another consequence of all this is called crowding out. When taxes are so high, the middle class can't afford to save as much, and they don't have the incentive for it either, since they rely on the government support for a rainy day. The problem is that it reduces responsibility. Also, savings fuel long-run business investment, so the welfare state slows down economic growth. This is one of the features of Scandinavian countries. Another major problem is the incentive for tax evasion, which is illegal, or tax avoidance, which is legal, like underreporting one's income or hiring lawyers and accountants to rearrange and reframe one's one's tax report to qualify for exemptions, or offshoring business, seeking tax havens. And remember, multimillionaires have every incentive to do so because to them it adds up to a lot. If you see a society with a lot of luxury cars, it doesn't mean they're rich. It means they have a high tax rate because the car they drive is exempt from taxes on capital gains. So people rationally convert their financial assets into cars in order to avoid taxes. But guess which one is more productive for the society? We are taxing the kind of asset which can create jobs and increase output, thereby directing people's investments into less productive forms. Now, we also talked about the idea of equal opportunity. Even the idea of equal opportunity is flawed. Think of this. If someone works really hard and saves a lot, are they entitled to pass it on to their children? Most of us would say yes. And that is the main incentive behind people saving money, because people live forever. Now you might be like, hang on, people don't live forever. They do. They live forever through their children. And that's what their behavior shows. They behave as if they live forever because they make these calculations. But guess what? That means that the child who's receiving all that inheritance will have more opportunity than other children. Saying that all children should have equal opportunity means penalizing and disincentivizing their parents. The child's initial position is beyond the child's control, for sure, but it's very much part of their parents' incentives. And because of all this mess, the government's revenue doesn't even increase. There are many studies showing that when the tax rate is reduced, it actually increases the government revenue because the very rich will no longer have the incentive to avoid or evade it. What I want to emphasize in all this is sensitivity about incentives. That's what you need to have as economists. People are dynamic. The moment you impose something on them, they'll find a way out of it. That's why government policy is never as successful as was intended. So record this slide number and summarize it in one sentence using your own words. Did you see that? It was crushed. To sum up, we can say that the moment we decide to slice the pie equally, its size will shrink because of incentives. And that's the famous dichotomy in economics between efficiency and equity. Efficiency means maximizing society's well-being with minimum costs and maximum benefits, getting the most of our resources, which means we must choose between two options. Either have a big pie at the expense of unequal slicing, or having a little pie that is sliced more equally. Ideally, you would like to have both, a big pie and a fair share for everyone, but that's not feasible. There is no such option. We must sacrifice one for the other. So we have to set our priorities, and here's a good summary. With equity, we're more egalitarian than with efficiency. One is government-driven as opposed to market-driven. Emphasis on equality compromises individual and economic liberty and can slow down economic growth. They also differ in terms of social mobility. Societies today are different mixes of the two, attempting to get the advantages of each, but it also means getting the disadvantages of each. Oh no, what have you done? A trade-off is inevitable because there is no free lunch. There is a compromise to make either way. Any attempt to build a heaven has rather created a hell. Those who aimed at creating a socialist utopia ended up with a dystopia. It's not because they didn't follow the socialist recipe correctly, but because the recipe ignores incentives and unintended consequences. So the welfare state was born in 1930 with the Great Depression, and it has ever grown since then. And today we just take it for granted that it must be there. It's because of these practical complications of equality that economists emphasize efficiency instead and give it a higher priority. Not because equality is less important, but because in practice there are so many impediments to it which ruin the whole project. So pause here and take notes. Inequality itself is not a problem. More important than inequality is its roots. There are some forms of inequality which are justifiable and others which are less legitimate. This is the kind of sensitivity I want you to take out of the course, to dig a bit deeper and not judge based on the surface, to ask meaningful and professional questions and not blindly hop on the mainstream trend. There is a subtle yet profound difference between economic rent and economic profit. Profit is non-zero sum. It's win-win. It means more consumption for buyers, more revenue for sellers, and more job opportunities for workers. That's how a free market works. It's a voluntary exchange that makes everyone better off. Economic rent is zero-sum. It's win-lose. If someone gets rich, it must be at the expense of someone else. Profit creates some added value in the process. Rent is only a transfer. So profit and rent are two ways of getting rich. One is selling a good or service that is demanded and valued with a high willingness to pay, or charging a high price on an existing good or service due to no competition because of market power and monopoly pricing. In one case, you'll have to improve your competitive edge, which is beneficial to everyone because you'll have to lower the price and enhance quality. In the other case, the way is to lobby for government intervention to gain a privileged position, and that comes at the expense of the consumers and taxpayers. It's all about where the resources are directed based on the highest expected value. In a society where the government makes most of the decisions, then companies have the incentive to suck up to the government by satisfying political parties. And that's the most rational thing to do. But if the decisions are made by the consumers in a market, then you'll have to appeal to the consumers by providing satisfying products. And inequality increases in both cases. But notice the difference. So the next time you hear someone talk about all the inequality between the rich and the poor, stop them right there and ask them, have you distinguished between the sources of their income? It's unprofessional and unfair to treat all inequality in the same way. Equality is so precious that we can't afford it. Oh no, I shouldn't have said that. A good example of profit versus rent is Uber versus taxi. Taxi drivers were earning a lot of rent before because they were licensed and they were in limited supply. There were few licenses for them. So they could charge almost monopoly prices. Uber made a lot of money, but through the market mechanism by providing affordable transportation to the riders and many jobs to millions of people. So the owners and shareholders of Uber got rich, but not in the same way as taxi drivers would get rich. So pause here, record this slide number, and summarize it. It's also important to distinguish between income inequality and wealth inequality. They're quite different actually. Income is a stream of earnings, ongoing. Wealth is a stock of property or assets, accumulated. Profit and rent are forms of income, and in terms of wealth, what matters again is not so much the size of wealth, but the form of wealth. If most of the wealth is in the form of mansions and yachts, then they're not very productive. They're not contributing to the society's well-being. It becomes zero-sum. Oh no, what a mess. However, most of the wealth of the multimillionaires is in the form, oh, that's so cool. It's in the form of assets which generate GDP and jobs. And this data is from the US. They don't take away opportunity from others. That kind of capital requires labor to work on it. It's not a substitute to labor, but a complement, right? So that's like business assets. These are the kinds of things that you never hear in public media or political debates. What you get there is the most superficial rhetoric without any nuance, only meant to stir the audience's emotions and bitterness without engaging them intellectually. And at the bottom of it all is envy, unfortunately. If we don't have some privilege, then let's drag down everyone to our level. That seems to be the bottom line of the inequality rhetoric anyway. Not to mention how the entire inequality debate is so subjective and arbitrary. What is our point of reference? Why compare ourselves to the top 1% today? Why not compare ourselves to the top 1% of 200 years ago? For instance, this dude, nice haircut, buddy. Look, he's not my boyfriend, but I feel bad for how much hatred is directed at him just because of his wealth, just because he's been successful. But he made that wealth by providing something of value to the society and enhancing the lives of consumers. If we criticize him, fine, but let's also admit all the added value and social well-being he generated. And most of his wealth is in the form of Amazon shares, investment capital that creates opportunities for others to rise up. Anyway, all of us, including Jeff, have limitations and room for improvement. And public equities are often a form of dodging taxes. Remember unintended consequences? But still, they recycle into the society, though not in the most efficient or productive way. So you don't have to take notes on the data here, but write the gist of the message in one sentence in your own words. To wrap up, there is a lot of debate over inequality, but inequality itself is not the biggest problem. More important is poverty, but we're still not there. The most meaningful measure is neither inequality nor poverty, but mobility. To what extent there is movement within the income distribution is also called social mobility. So whenever you hear a discussion about inequality, pause, because they're putting the focus on the wrong parameter. The real issue is mobility, which is applicable to each individual and across generations. So for individuals, the main determinant here is to what extent they can accumulate human capital, and what really matters there is job retention. So you see, for instance, single mothers often have low mobility because their job retention is low. Now, mobility is a double-edged sword because it means people can also go down. And the net effect is that there's going to be episodic or transitional poverty, but not so much chronic poverty. And that's what we see in Canada. Even using a relative measure, about 90% of households in the bottom quintile exited within 2 decades. That's promising. Transitional poverty shouldn't be a surprise because c'est la vie. Life has ups and downs. The government interfering to remove even transitional poverty is impatience, and it has unintended consequences. By the way, the core of all government intervention is an element of impatience. Now, at the social level, income mobility is positively correlated to economic freedom, which itself has several elements. Oh, that's cool. So the idea here is that the bigger the government in terms of its spending and taxing, the more regulations, the more protectionism, and the more license requirements will hurt disproportionately those at the bottom of the income ladder compared to those at the top. They would slow down the wage growth for those at the bottom and increase their living expenses more so than the rest of the society. So if you want improvements in income mobility, we must reduce these impediments. The question isn't how far apart the rungs of the ladder are, but what are the chances of individuals to climb up? And it hasn't diminished. Pause here and take notes. You might have heard that the rich is getting richer, the poor is getting poorer. Well, sorry, that's a fallacy. I mean, first of all, the most important part of this fallacy is that these are not the same people over time, as I emphasized. But also, all the boats are rising, though at a different rate. Another more valid concern is that if we have a lot of people with significantly more income or more wealth, then they could rig the political system. But this also is a fallacy. Why? Because again, these are not the same people, and also because of the importance of income mobility. So they're going to be, as long as there's income mobility, those at the top are also changing. Besides, the political surveys show that the orientations of those at the top and bottom and middle are not significantly different. Wow, that was cool. Let me share with you a few quotes by Milton Friedman, who is the brightest economist that I know of. One of them is the idea of not accusing people because of their intentions, but looking at the results, seeing to what extent the means that they use and offer are effective in achieving those results. All right. So what is proposed in the name of equality and morality often does not serve that objective and sometimes even harms the very people it was claimed to serve. Another one is that there is a political self-interest, which you find in socialism, in big government, because government is also driven by self-interest. Like all the lobbying and the politicians themselves, they're also humans, as opposed to economic self-interest, which is found in the market, in the businesses. This one's also interesting because giving a higher priority to liberty allows us to achieve other goals as well. So liberty, freedom, is not only a desirable goal in itself, but it's also a means towards achieving other goals. All right. Now I'm showing the best content that I found. You might be like, sir, you're brainwashing us, or what is all this crap with Milton Friedman? Look, this is what I've got. Over my 20 years of studying and teaching economics, this is the best that I found, and I'm sharing it with you. And it's ultimately up to you to choose your position. Don't adopt what I say wholesale. Don't adopt what anybody says wholesale. Assess them based on your judgment, and then come up with your unique position. The idea is to be exposed by the arguments of both sides so that you can make a better decision and have good arguments for your own position. Today we classified economies based on ownership and distribution, where ownership can be either private or public, and distribution can be either market or state. When you put these two together, we get market economy. When we put these two together, we get socialism. And we talked about three main socioeconomic objectives. As an economist, we should also be sensitive about incentives. So all economies try to target these things to various degrees. Socialism is based on a zero-sum mentality, and it leads to a welfare state, and we get inequality based on rent. Market economy is based on a non-zero-sum mentality. It leads to income mobility, and it gives rise to inequality due to profit. And I would emphasize the idea of income mobility as our frame of reference as opposed to inequality, as well as the meaning of welfare state and its limitations, and also the theory behind it. So pause here, do your own concept map, and try to, we had some old concepts here which are recurring. You should also be able to include some of the missing concepts like paternalism, Robin Hood effect, and also the different forms of equity and poverty. So try to add a couple of things here so that it becomes your own. How would you update your answer to the myth of the day based on what you learned in today's lesson? Pause here and add a couple of concepts from today's lesson to your answer. In terms of counterexamples, we can look at the health conditions and life expectancy of even the poorest people today, as well as a lot of goods and services which didn't even exist before. Basically, our point of reference is very arbitrary when it comes to the comparison of poor and rich, and also betterment versus worsening. What is it that determines better lifestyle? In terms of counterexample, this myth is based on a zero-sum mentality. If somebody is better off, it must be at the expense of somebody else. Whereas in a market economy, one can get rich only by offering something of value to others. When they say that the rich and the poor, it implies that they are the same households, but they're not. We need to track them, the same people, over time, and then we can see that they jump from one income bracket to another according to the stages of their life. So that is also very natural that some people will be poor when they are, let's say, in their 20s, but the important thing is if they stay poor over time. So that's the whole idea of mobility. And at the end of the day, we have to think about the opportunity cost of equity. And sometimes it may not be worth it. We do not live in a perfect world, and we have to choose our imperfections. And hereby ends this series of videos. Congratulations for finishing your introductory economics course. Being in the class with students is a great pleasure to me. With these videos, I've deprived myself and I've been marginalized to a voice on the screen. Oh no, what have I done? I did this because I want my students to be autonomous learners who can stand on their own feet, learn in their own way, and go at their own pace. What I want you to take out of the course is the sensitivity to ask meaningful questions about incentives, sacrifices, and alternatives, and to realize that there is no free lunch, so that you are not deceived by common myths. This is literally homework for life, and it starts with yourself. Every moment of your life is an application of opportunity cost. Pick your battle responsibly and stand by its consequences. Thank you very much for your effort over the past 3 months and for putting up with my lame jokes. Oh, you know, what have I done? I hope you also appreciate the work that was put into making these videos. Each video took me about 20 hours to make. Each slide took me about 1 hour. Now you might be like, what have you done? Yes, that's how I spend my vacation. This is my way of saying how much I care about you. You can also see it as an example of being passionate about one's work. Pick a career path that you feel passionate about, for which you would willingly work overtime and over the weekends, and which doesn't feel like work to you. That really makes a difference for yourself and for those around you. Farewell, my dears.